Good evening again and welcome. I'd like to welcome Venerable Ratana from Sri Lanka, who will be joining us this evening. And tonight, in our continuing series of talks on aspects of psychology as understood in Buddhism, we're going to talk about a problem that has become increasingly common in modern societies like Singapore and other developed countries, and that's the problem of depression. It seems that when you look at traditional cultures, traditional societies, they don't even have a word for this problem. That's not because in traditional cultures people didn't get down in the dumps sometimes. That's not because despair was unknown. But certainly it appears that it was not as common as it has become in most modern industrial societies. And in fact, so common has it become that companies that make antidepressants, Valium and things like this, if you really want to be assured of making a lot of money, put your money in a drug company, in shares in drug companies, particularly those that make drugs like Valium and what have you, because people have become so depressed, life has become apparently so meaningless to so many people, that depression has become a major problem in most industrial cultures. Of course, depression was known at the time of the Buddha. They used to call it domanassa. Dukkha is physical and psychological suffering, and domanassa is sadness or depression. And we could say that there are three types. The first type we're not going to talk about because it has its origins in some malfunction of the brain. Some people, because of some malfunction in the brain, they are constantly depressed. And the only treatment for this is some form of drug therapy. So leaving that aside, there are two other manifestations of depression. There is what you might call occasional depression. And then there's what's called existential depression. So we'll have a look at the first of these for a while because it is really quite common. We all feel sad, we all grieve, we all feel down in the dumps, gloomy or depressed from time to time. And when we feel like this, there is a feeling of boredom, loss of interest, we feel sad, we may cry, and this may continue for some time, and then usually we get over it. This occasional depression can be caused by several things. One of the most common is the loss of, through death, of a loved one. Somebody very close to us dies, and we feel very depressed for a certain period of time. And it seems that there's a rationale behind this depression. For example, if somebody that we know and love has been very ill for a long period of time, and we've been expecting them to die, then it seems people feel grief for a short period of time, and then they recover from it. If somebody dies in ripe old age, 85, 90, 95, we feel for a short period of time sadness, and then we can generally get along with our lives. However, if two persons have just married for a few years and then one dies, or if parents have been bringing up their children and then one dies in an accident or unexpectedly, it's not uncommon for the parents or the siblings to experience long periods of grief. And in the case of parents, and particularly mothers, with the unexpected death of a child, the grief, the depression can last sometimes for many years. Sometimes we feel depressed because of failure, which leads to the feeling that we are in some way inadequate. This seems to be certainly a problem here in Singapore. And in societies like Singapore and Japan, where great stress is put on the importance of succeeding, particularly with young people. The type of pressure that people have to live under, quite often, only adults would be under that pressure in certain societies. So prior to exams, there's a great deal of anxiety. After the exams, depending on what the results are, there's either a feeling of elation, there's a feeling of relief, or sometimes there is depression, because one has failed to live up to one's expectations, there's fear of the future, and so one starts to feel depressed. People sometimes become extremely ashamed. They don't like to talk about their exam results. They feel very inadequate, and they suffer from depression. Another cause of depression, not as common in a society like this, but common enough, is a sense of loss in relation to success, or wealth, or fame, or youth. I have frequently come across people who have told me that until 1983, business was going well, everything was marvellous, and then they lost everything in 1983, 84, when there were problems in the economy in Singapore. So they lived in $1 million flat, now they live in a $500,000 flat. They used to have 5 cars, now they have 1. They used to send their kids to Raffles, now they send them to Outram Secondary. And as a result of that, they feel extremely depressed. There's still enough to eat and plenty to do, financially secure. But in terms of what they had before, they experience a sense of loss. They've come down in the world, as they would say. They lose their status, and that's related to it. It's a very interesting phenomenon in the world of theatre, and particularly in the world of cinema. You very frequently hear people complaining that at one time they were in the spotlight. They were given that strange name, a star. People chased after them. They wanted their autograph. There were articles about them in magazines, what they ate, what restaurants they went to, who they were going out with, what their next film was, etc. And then, due to changes in taste or whatever it happens to be, they're not as popular as they were, and they become obscure. And a lot of people find it very difficult to adjust to this. Having been famous and having had a lot of attention, they now find themselves obscure. Nobody chases after them for their autograph anymore, and they start to feel quite depressed. But perhaps the most common form of depression related to losing something is related to old age. When we're young, we have vigour and health and good looks, and then as we age, we lose all of these. They're taken from us. Now, most people adjust to this process quite well. But some people, particularly if they've had a great deal of vigour, if they've been exceptional sportsmen or women, or if they've been particularly good-looking, they find it very difficult to reconcile the changes that are taking place in them. Old age tends to be looked at with a great deal of fear and anxiety. They become over-anxious about their health, their looks, etc. And of course, you can stave this off. You can stave off the results of aging for a given period of time. And nowadays with science, you can even make it appear that you're much younger than you were before. You can have plastic surgery. You can put padding in here, there and everywhere. You can have injections. And you can look certainly somewhat younger, but you can't stave it off forever. And even the most optimistic person knows this. And so they start to become very depressed, anxious, worried, because they don't have the vigour, the health, or the looks that they had before. So all of these would be examples of depression that we have from time to time. They are related to certain events or certain circumstances. They arise because of some trauma that we've had to put up with. And in fact, Buddhism would say they are a natural part of living in the type of world that we do live in. According to the Buddha, there are 8 vicissitudes that characterize the human condition. These are called the Attaloka Dhammas, the 8 conditions of the world. Happiness and sadness, praise and blame, gain and loss, fame and obscurity. And if you look at ordinary human life, it is a play and an interplay of these things. We're famous, then we become obscure, then we may become famous again. We're wealthy, we may lose it all, we may get some of it back. There is a constant interplay of these 8 things. And because it is quite normal, natural, to want to be happy, to want to be praised, to rejoice in being praised, to like to have possessions, and to be popular and liked, because it's only natural, it is likewise natural that when we lose those things, we will go through a period of adjustment. And that is one of the characteristics of that period of adjustment is depression. We will feel sad, down in the dumps, gloomy. We will feel sorry for ourselves. So under normal circumstances, it is natural, it is understandable to have periods of depression from time to time. And we can cope with them because time heals all wounds. Eventually we get over it, we buck up, we cheer up, some happy circumstance comes along and we forget the difficulties we had and we're able to function. But that doesn't always happen. There is another type of depression which has become increasingly common, which we may call existential depression. This is when people suffer from depression for long periods of time, and it starts to affect the normal functioning of the ordinary human being. They become melancholic, gloomy, pessimistic. They come to suffer from what is called chronic depression. Now, there are certain reasons for this too. A great deal has been written on it. Doctors often are confronted by it, as are psychiatrists. There's been a lot of discussion on why it is that in societies that are affluent, relatively secure, where there's a great deal of opportunities, why is it there's so many people suffering from chronic depression? Well, the first cause of this, and one that is not always taken into account, is that it may be a result of a deep insight. If it is true, as the Buddha says, that existence is suffering, and if we come to see this deeply and truly, it may indeed make us feel very depressed. If it's true that loss follows from gain, and that sadness follows from happiness, and indeed that death is the end of life, then perhaps it is understandable that people become depressed. When they have a good, hard look at reality, it's understandable that they may feel depressed. And, of course, it is not only Buddhism that says that life is suffering. Perhaps the most beautiful book in the Bible, certainly the most neglected, is what is known as Ecclesiastes. This single book probably has more wisdom in it than all of the other books in the Bible. And the first words in this beautiful book of wisdom is meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. The sun rises and the sun sets and it rises again. There is nothing new in the world. Everything's been done before. Everything ends in sadness and ashes. And we don't know who the author of that book was. In contemporary Christianity, for some strange reason, they always say that whoever wrote it was an old and very depressed person. But looking at it as a Buddhist, one could only come to the conclusion was that, well, he may have been depressed. It's hard to say from reading it. But one thing's for certain, he had a deep insight into the nature of existence. It's true. He talks about wealth, gain, and he says that ultimately it has no meaning. Well, any wise person would agree with that. He talks about fame, and he says that people will praise you in that. But what is it? It's empty, and ultimately it doesn't lead to anything. Well, any really wise and insightful person would tell you that. And of course, in recent times, even philosophers have come to this conclusion. One of the more popular philosophers of this century, Jean-Paul Sartre, said that life is nothing more than a useless passion. Even the existentialist Christian philosopher, Søren Kierkegaard, he came to the conclusion that life was absolutely meaningless. And people have often suggested that these philosophers were very pessimistic. But if you look at most of these philosophers, they weren't particularly pessimistic. When you read their writings, you may get that impression. But somebody like Jean-Paul Sartre led a very full, a very fruitful, and apparently a relatively happy life. Certainly no less happy than the majority of people. Simply putting one's finger on reality and seeing that in some senses it is meaningless and empty doesn't necessarily lead to depression. But to some people it does. And probably the reason for this is that they have come to expect that life should be different. They have come to understand that life has not fulfilled their expectations. They have wanted life to be one particular way. It has emerged that it is not like that. They have wanted life to be full and fulfilling. They wanted things to go the way they want. They wanted to live forever. They wanted to be continually happy. And they find that life doesn't do that. It doesn't work that way. And so they decide to turn their back on a world that has disappointed them, and they become profoundly depressed. There are other approaches to having a deeper understanding into the nature of reality. Some people see that a life can be rather meaningless, that no matter how sweet the fruit you have, that you get, that when you look at the end and you understand that it all ends in death, some people, rather than reacting by becoming depressed, they decide, okay, I've got a few more years to go, a few more decades, by God, I'm going to enjoy it. They become hedonists. They decide to try to cram as much pleasure in the time that they've got left. Very nicely described in that old saying, eat, drink and be merry, because tomorrow you die. This unfortunately is not a very, for a while this seems to work. You can stave off reality. You can keep it at bay. But of course, one of the ultimate outcomes of hedonism is a slightly different version of depression, and that's boredom. Hedonism ends in boredom. And probably one of the most exquisite of all sufferings is boredom. For example, you may have attended a long talk, and you're sitting there and it aches, it pains, you want it to end. It's so boring. Now some people see life like that, and certainly hedonism usually ends in boredom. The reason for it is because of the very nature of the sense organs. The sense organs have got nerves in them. When these nerves are stimulated in a particular way, we get pleasure. But just as we get calluses on our fingers, on our hands, if we use them often, we get, as it were, psychological calluses on pleasure. If we experience pleasure a lot, we enjoy it, but after a while, to get that same level of satisfaction, we need to stimulate the senses to a higher degree. And then for a while we will get fulfillment and satisfaction, but then the senses start to become dull again, and we need more stimulation. And of course it gets to the stage where you can't go beyond a certain point, and then you break down and you have boredom, or worse, perversion. Some people they look at life, at existence, they find it rather frightening prospect, so they retreat into delusion. They can't find any meaning in life, and so they look for ideologies or philosophies that claim to offer meaning. Well, the meaning of life is God wants us to do this, or He's got a special plan for us, or something like that. And so they retreat into that. And there is no doubt that this, once again, for a while, can be very satisfying. One can, if you try very hard, convince yourself that you're going to live forever, that there is a possibility of living in some world where nothing ever goes wrong. And when you get there, you'll meet all your friends again, and it'll just be wonderful. We'll all live together forever. Quite honestly, if you think about it, it sounds like a recipe for hell. But certainly some people, without thinking too deeply about it, it sounds a better alternative than having to look reality in the face and see its true nature. So they become religious. They believe that there's some plan, that everything has a meaning, that everything that happens has happened in order to teach us something, or to show us something, to reward us or to punish us. And of course it is possible for some people to continue that belief for a long time. Some people forever. But many people cannot. Sooner or later, that old spoiler, reality, breaks through, and one cannot continue to maintain that belief. And then one falls into tremendous meaninglessness. One has what is called a spiritual crisis. So, if it's true that reality has no meaning, that existence is suffering, and if the possible responses to this are hedonism, or retreating in deluded religious beliefs, or simply becoming depressed, what is the Buddhist solution to the problem of the nature of reality? Well, the first thing about Buddhism is that it doesn't offer us any easy solutions, and it doesn't fob off on us any deluded ideas. The very first principle in Buddhism is get it straight right from the beginning that life is suffering. Now, some people will turn away from that. They will say, oh, how depressing, or how pessimistic. But sooner or later one will come to see, of course, that is in fact true. In some people's cases, in fortunate people's cases, they see this when they are young. That gives them plenty of time to adjust to that reality. Many people don't see it until they're old. They think life is marvellous, life is wonderful, I'll live forever, I'll be young and vital and all things bright and beautiful, and everything will be okay forever. But then as they start getting old, their teeth fall out and their friends die, and they read in the newspaper the horrible things that human beings do to each other. Gradually they start to become depressed, disillusioned, world-weary, and only then they turn to the Dharma. But if you actually look at the Dharma, one of the wonderful things about it, it doesn't try to pretend. It confronts you with the major problem, the central problem of existence right from the very beginning. Ladies and gentlemen, the good news is that life is suffering. Now, one may believe that or disbelieve it, but if you take it as a given, it starts to make a lot of sense. Now, in Europe, when Buddhism first started to become popular at the very beginning of the last century, one of the most popular philosophers of that time was the German philosopher Schopenhauer, and he was very influenced by Buddhism. And he was a profoundly pessimistic man. And he built a marvelous philosophical system based on Buddhist and Hindu ideas, which had a profound influence on German Romanticism, the young Germans at that time, which is one of the reasons why some of the very first Buddhist monks were Germans. They came from an intellectual background which was very pessimistic. And for many decades, it was people who had turned away from life, disappointed and depressed, that became interested in Buddhism, because they thought that Buddhism was reaffirming what they already believed, that the most appropriate response to life is sadness and gloominess. Of course, now that Buddhism is better known in the West, considerably better known, we know that that's not the general Buddhist outlook. While Buddhism says that life is suffering, that existence has no meaning, the most appropriate response to that is not to depression. In the Samyutta Nikaya, the Buddha talks about these steps that lead naturally one from another as a result of seeing the nature of existence. It's a discourse that is not often discussed, but in the nature of, when we are talking about depression, it's a very meaningful discourse. And in this, the Buddha talks about a causal chain. The first is suffering. The second is faith. The third is tranquility. The fourth is joy. The fifth is happiness. The sixth is concentration. The seventh is knowledge and vision. The eighth is disgust. The ninth is the fading of passions. And the 10th is freedom. And the Buddha says that each of these states, if one has the proper attitude and the proper insight, each state will lead naturally to the next one. So if we look at them, several of them relate to depression. The first is suffering. We suffer. Even if we're healthy, we may be suffering psychologically. If we're happy now, we will not be later. The very nature of existence is that it is suffering. We respond to that in different ways. Some people try to deny it. Some people try to cram in as much pleasure as they can to eliminate that suffering. But there is no escape. We have to confront it eventually. Now, when we confront suffering, and we just see it as it is, not trying to explain it away with myths or stories, then we discover that there is a philosophy that starts at this very point. It starts at the place we're at, and it's called Dharma. Buddhism starts with the first noble truth, suffering. The third noble truth is that suffering can be overcome. Now, if we are confronted by suffering, we come into contact with the Dharma that promises freedom from suffering. Faith will arise, saddha. That is, we develop faith in the Buddha, the Dharma and the Sangha. We take the three refuges. We start to practice Dharma with varying degrees of understanding, varying degrees of commitment. But if we walk the path with confidence and diligence, it will lead to tranquility. We start to become calm and more relaxed, more reconciled to suffering rather than angry at it. So faith, saddha, leads to tranquility, passaddhi. When the mind is tranquil, we become joyful, piyati. We are happy, sukha. Then the Buddha says, when we are tranquil, joyful and happy, it becomes possible to meditate, it becomes possible to concentrate, it becomes possible to start to adjust and transform the mind, so that happiness leads to concentration, samadhi. When the mind is very concentrated and it starts to look within itself, when we start to look at ourselves, we develop a state which the Buddha calls yatha bhuta jnana dassana, a knowledge and vision of things as they really are. Now, normally when we develop a knowledge and vision of things as they really are, if you've lived through one war and you've been told that that's the war to end all wars, and 6 months later another one breaks out, and if over a period of time you become increasingly disillusioned, depressed and melancholic towards what human beings do to each other, within our society, within families, between nations, when you come to see what the Buddha says is true, that everything is suffering, we start to become very depressed. But if we have the right attitude and we develop yatha bhuta jnana dassana, a knowledge and vision of things as they really are, according to the Buddha, this will lead not to depression, but a state that he calls nibbida. Now, this word is usually translated as loathing or disgust. They're very powerful words. You think of disgust. You get disgusted with yourself, or you get disgusted with other people, or you reach under the hospital bed and you pull out something and you take the lid off it and, you feel disgusted. It's a very strong meaning, a very strong word. However, what it means in Dharma is, it's very hard to translate, but it has a variety of meanings. It can mean to turn away, dispassion, disillusionment, or perhaps the best word of all is disenchantment. We become disenchanted. And under normal circumstances, we are indeed very much enchanted. It's as if reality has enchanted us so that we don't really see it as it is, particularly when we're young. We were talking about that last week, the fire of youth. And then suddenly we become disenchanted. And indeed, in one of the Buddha's discourses, he describes this as being like a man who is at a theatrical performance and he's watching a magician. And that magician pulls rabbits out of hats and does all sorts of remarkable things. And one is enchanted, entertained, impressed. You wonder how it could be done. And then you go behind the scenes. You go backstage. And there you see all of the apparatus, the strings, the trapdoors, the mirrors. And you become disenchanted. It's not magical anymore. You don't feel disappointed, you don't feel angry, you don't feel disgusted, but that sense of awe that you had is certainly not there anymore because you are now disenchanted. The enchantment has gone. So perhaps one of the best translations of this word is disenchantment. When you see things as they really are, you become disenchanted. I've got a theory, I don't know whether it's true, but don't you find it unusual or interesting that people always make love with the lights off? I think that there is a very sound psychological reason for this. You don't want to look too closely. Okay? Best to keep the lights off. I used to think it was because people were shy, but of course that's not so. I mean, if you've lived with somebody for a long time, you're not shy. There's a very good reason for it. If the lights are on, you can see all that blubber, the scars and the pimples and all of that sort of thing. So it's best to keep the lights off. You don't want to disenchant your partner. You don't want to feel disenchanted. You don't want to look too closely. However, this word nibbida has another meaning. Nibbida. The bid comes from vidya, which means to know. But it's also related to the word, or the word vidya is also related to the word to laugh. In Sanskrit drama, the clown or the fool is always called the vidurshaka. So I think that there may be this second response. It may be that when we look very closely and we see the true nature of reality, on one hand we may become dispassionate. On the other hand, we may suddenly understand that we have been deluded, indeed tricked, for so long that we start to see that the joke's on us, and that it invokes a sense of humour, laughter even. I have said this before, if you tease a child, you close your hand and tease a child with a sweet, and the child tries to catch your hand and you tease him, and eventually you give the child your hand and he opens it and he finds there is no sweet in it. One child will be quite annoyed. Another one may laugh. He will see that the joke's on him. So when we see the real nature of reality, it may not be that we necessarily become depressed or sad or gloomy, but rather that we either become calm with a touch of a sense of humour as well. And when we see the true nature of reality, the next step is viraga. Raga means colour. Viraga means when colour has been, something colourful has been left out in the sun and the colour starts to fade. So the colour goes out of your life. The passion, the strong responses to this enticement, to that enticement, starts to fade away, and one starts to experience that highest of Buddhist qualities, equanimity, in the face of the Ataloka Dhammas, loss and gain, pain and happiness, fame and obscurity. Rather than being elated one minute and depressed the next, we have that equanimity, that stoic calm that is so characteristic of the Buddhas. And then we have what the Buddha calls vimukti, freedom. When we are no longer pulled into, when we no longer react to a reality, rather than become depressed, we become calm and freed. And so, in actual fact, whereas in the case of occasional depression, time heals that. If we are suffering from long-term depression, the best cure for this is the acceptance of reality. Now, most people will only accept death after somebody close to them has died and they've gone through a period of depression. Most people will only accept any of the vicissitudes of life once it has wounded them and they've gone through a period of depression. But if we practice the Dharma genuinely, we have to understand that Dharma is not like a lot of conventional religions which try to convince us that everything's wonderful, that everything's marvellous, that everything will go well, that all we have to do is pray and everything will work out. There are two responses to reality. One is that we can pretend it's different from what it is, and we may be able to keep up that pretense for a long time. The other one is to gradually reconcile ourselves to reality so that we come to understand it. We come to accept it. And this is the path of peace. This is the path that generally leads to a freedom from depression. This is the path that eventually leads to anuttara ceta vimukti, utter freedom of mind. And that is the aim, that is the goal, that is the culmination.
Bahum sasamabinim mintasayudang tang kirime kelang udita gora sahasena maharang Dannadi Dhamma Virina Hindva